How bad it is doesn't matter. How long you cry for doesn't matter. Do you understand?
Yeah. So that sounds like a universal truth in itself.
It is.
Yeah.
It is one of the primary universal truths. It was one of the first ones I had to recognise in this life in order to progress. That makes sense? Yeah. It is one of God's universal truths about how God designed the soul. Yeah. Sandra?
So that's what I was going to ask you. Like when you first started, did you like feel stuff first?
This was the very first universal truth I had to accept.
So you were like, okay, how do I have this relationship with God? And God was
No, I
like,
didn't even consider a relationship with God at the time. I just thought, I want to progress, I want to be happier, what do I have to do? And the very first truth I had to accept was, I've got to learn how to feel all my feelings. The very first one, in this life.
And then once that entered your heart, you were humble.
Once that entered my heart and I realised this is working, this is effective, then I go, wow, this is what nobody does. But it's what I need to do all the time. Like so from then on it was like any situation, that's what I do. Every situation, this is what I do. Does that make sense? Yeah, but it was the fundamental thing I had to learn first.
And you didn't even involve God at the beginning?
No, I didn't. No. I could only listen to God's truths after that, because that thing would have precluded me from listening to God's truths. You understand? Because all God's truths have to enter you emotionally, and if you're unable to feel your emotions, then none of God's truths are going to enter you. So it was the very first thing I had to accept. It took me quite a number of months to accept, maybe 3 months to accept.
And to accept, you released that it wasn't like in your soul, you didn't feel it was true to start with, so you had to feel the pain of the fact that you had this corrupt faith.
Yeah, and also I had to release the whole reasons why I wasn't letting myself feel. And there was a whole bunch of reasons why. They were relating to my religion, my upbringing, my friends and family, and what they wanted from me, and lots of different reasons. And also because I thought a lot of my feelings would be too painful to feel. Is fundamentally what I believe. And once I had to give up those beliefs, and giving up each one of those beliefs was painful. I had to cry to give them up. But once I gave them up, after that I was absolutely convinced. It didn't take long. I was absolutely convinced that my emotional openness was the way I progressed. Does that make sense? Yeah. And once I understood that, I no longer had a corrupt faith in managing my feelings and controlling my feelings, and I no longer was stressed out about crying for a few hours. Do you know what I mean? Now I could cry for days and days, and I wasn't bothered by it. I wasn't worried I was going nuts or anything. Makes sense? Because there are some of the false beliefs you have.
Yeah.
That if you cry for 3 days, you go crazy. This is why the average person, somebody's crying, what does everybody else do? They're in a panic. They're trying to calm the person down. And you sure you're all right, love? You want me to get you a drink? Do you need a cup of tea? Do you need a pill? What can I give you a Valium? The average person is so panicked about feeling anything of any duration that if you cry, like what I realised was I had to remove myself from my family, because if I stayed with any of my family at all, including my son Tristan, I had to remove myself from, because he was projecting at me all the time that he couldn't handle it. And so in the end I had to say, you live next door, you're not living in my house anymore, because you're stopping me from feeling, you're trying to stop me from feeling because you can't handle it. No, I'm okay, I can handle it. Does that make sense? And everyone around you gets in a panic, and they all worry that you're going crazy, and they all want to report, like in my case, they wanted to report me to a psychologist about, how unstable I was and whatever else. And I felt really good, actually. I felt quite stable, more stable than I ever felt my whole life, because I was I was experiencing the relief of things. So every time I had a good cry about something, I felt after that the relief of that thing, And so I was no longer feeling stressed out by that thing anymore, because it was gone. And once I realised how well it worked, it was sort of like, wow, I can approach this with everything, with everything in my life. And I started to also realise after that, with my longing for God returned, because up until then I didn't have one. a longing for God. I went through a period where I didn't have any longing for God at all, but my longing for God returned, and my longing, my belief that I could receive truths from God returned, because I started realizing that all the truths were emotional, and this process was the way in which I was going to receive them. You understand? So all that returned as well. My ability to receive that truth returned. So a lot of you believe, meeting me now, you sort of believe that, I know a lot of things that all just come to my mind from some source and you don't really understand why. But 30 years ago, I was completely blocked to absolutely everything. Yep. My own situation, my own welfare, love of myself, love of others, love of God, feeling God's love, completely blocked to everything. And you know, it was a pretty tumultuous time in terms of the pain, the levels in my life. But once I started realizing feeling is the way that I get back everything, it was a lot easier to feel things then, because the faith changed. You understand? So I went from this numbed out place to a feeling place in the space of probably, well, I made some major strides in the first 3 months actually. And then the next 2 years I solidified this belief that my feelings were my way forward. And then after that, like anybody I talked to was like, no, you're not feeling your feelings, that's why nothing's changing, you know. And of course nobody believes you, because they're all in a state of trying to keep everything under wraps, right? But yeah. Oh.
Does it matter if you felt causal emotion or effect emotions, or you just felt everything?
It didn't even matter.
No.
I went through some effect emotions first, oftentimes, and it took me, 2 or 3 or 4 days, and sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 months crying about something, and then I realised, I'm a bit stupid. Like that was just the effect of the thing. You know what I mean? And then when I started connecting to the cause of it, then within a few days, usually things cleared up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But it didn't matter either way, because I realised after a while that if something wasn't changing, then it meant it was an effect thing.
Yeah.
And I just had to be more honest. I just had to be more truthful. And the more I was willing to be truthful, the more of God's truth you can accept. And therefore you work out really rapidly, that's where it wasn't truthful. You know, I found myself crying after a relationship breakup. This was before I knew who I was. After a relationship breakup, I found myself crying for quite a few weeks about it. And then at the end I thought, she doesn't have to love me. And then once I cried about the fact that nobody has to love me, I was no longer upset about nobody loving me. Up until then, I was crying about this person not loving me, and that person not loving me, or one person I was focused on not loving me. But after I went through enough of that emotion to work out actually they didn't need to love me, and then I cried about the fact, that was pretty gut wrenching to cry that actually nobody had to love me, not a single person on this planet has to love me. Once I worked through that and realised that I might be completely alone and nobody might love me the rest of my life, and I cried that out. That was the cause. And once I cried that out, it was like, it's all right if nobody loves me. But that was also when I first started realising that actually God probably did love me as well. I started realising that actually there were people that are unseen, and God probably did love me. Before then I didn't think God loved me. Yeah. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yep. But every change I have made has been because of an emotional release. I haven't made a single one through my intellect. And that still applies to this very day. Yep. Every change has only been through an emotional release. That's how I can say to you with definitive truth, God's truth can only come to you emotionally. You can't think it. Because there's plenty of times where I've thought I knew things beforehand, but never felt them. And if you can't feel them, they're not real. They only become real when you feel them. Yeah. So that's what happened to me, and I'm guaranteeing it will happen to you. And now that I've had plenty of experience with spirits and others that I've helped, and also remembering my prior life and remembering our spirit life, because none of my memories were even possible without it. I couldn't even remember who I was without this. I couldn't even have the emotions associated with being Jesus without first having the emotions associated with being emotional, right? And so none of the memories of anything else reappeared to me until I went through this. My decisions that I made in my life couldn't change until I went through this. But after I started going through this, a lot of things started happening sort of like naturally. Like what I find is that God sort of, once you get into harmony with it emotionally, God's going, oh, now I can share this with you. Now I can share that with you. And now I can put yourself in this situation and you act appropriately. You know, now I can give you this situation and you'll act appropriately there too. You know, now I can put you in this situation and you won't become immoral because of it. Now I can, you know what I mean? Now I can do these things for you and you won't, you know, so what I also see is that God is handling us, you know, like, and when I say handling us, God's got us in his hand saying, until you do this thing, I can't give you the other things. You got to do this thing and then I can give you some other things. And your readiness to deal with these other things is dependent on you dealing with this thing. Right? And that's only dependent on you making the decision to deal with that thing. And it has to be emotional every time. There is no changes you can make that will not be emotional. And that applies even to the absorption of truth after you become at one with God and when you've got no other bad emotions to feel. Even the new truths will be emotional. You know, you'll have tears, but they'll be tears of joy as you accept them. You understand? After you become at one with God, there's still a lot of crying that goes on after you become at one with God, but because of tears of joy about accepting a new truth. You know, you're blown away, you know, you're so blown away by the new truth that it just affects you emotionally. Do you know what I mean? And that's what happens. God's trying to stretch you to the point where you're going, I have the potential to become limitless in the way that I express emotion. God's limitless, and God's trying to make us become more like him. So as we progress, we'll approach how God deals with everything. God's emotions are infinitely powerful. That's why every single one of us can be infused with God's love, and still God's got love left over. You know, because God's emotions are infinitely powerful. And the way I become more like God is by my emotions becoming as infinitely, you know, more approaching the infinite powerful emotions of God. Make sense? Yeah. You can see from a logical point of view, it makes sense, right? Yep. But you're not going to feel it until you change emotionally. Yeah. So a lot of the words I speak are trying to convince your intellect enough to convince your emotions that, because you're the one that's got to convince your own emotions, right? I can't do that for you.
To allow them.
To allow them to just be in the flow, you know. You are going to have to convince yourself of that. I'm saying to you categorically that it's a part of God's way. Yep. And I've explained to you the physical and scientific reasons as to why it's a part of God's way. But at some point, you're only going to be convinced by doing it. Yep. Yep. And aside from myself here, none of you are yet completely free with your emotions, but there are some that are starting to be. You know, and you can recognize them easy enough, can't you? It's like Elle has started to be, you know that Phoebe has started to be, and you know some of you have started to be because you can connect to your emotions a bit more freely now. But we want to get to the stage where it's completely free, that you can do it. Completely without restriction. If you want to cry now, or you cry now. Like, if you want to laugh now, you laugh now. And you don't second guess or question any of them. You just have them. You understand? You just be what it is right now that you feel that you need to be. And you've got to be honest. The 5 tools are still essential. You've got to be honest. Because if you're going for 3 months and you've let go of emotion for 3 months and there's still no change, then you haven't let go of emotion. You've been living in some alter place of like demand or addiction not being met, having a tantrum, is what's been happening. If there's no change, and there's no change, effortless change, and when I say effortless, what I mean is after you experience the emotion, if it's not easier to do the right thing, then you haven't experienced the emotion. Does that make sense? Yeah, it should be easier to do the right thing after you've had your emotions. So if it's not easier, then you haven't had the emotion, or you haven't had the right one. Or you won't let, and really it's you won't let yourself have the right one. Obviously, because your emotions, there's only one person who has control of them. God doesn't have control of them. I don't either. Your family doesn't. Your friends don't. Your partner doesn't. Only you have control of them. Only you. Nobody else. So if you're not feeling an emotion, it's not because of anybody else, right? It's because you're making a decision not feel an emotion. Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? The emotions are in you. Only you have control of them. They're in your soul. Only you can control them. You can control them, or you can just let them be free. You can imprison them, which is what the majority of us have done, or you can open the gate to the prison and let them out. That's what you can do. One way or the other, that's the choice you make. And that's how you get from being stoic to being free with your feelings. By making that choice to be free. Now, there are some reasons why we don't make the choice. So for some of us, it's because we're too afraid of what other people think of us. Because that can certainly cause you to not be free with your feelings, right? For some of us, it's the impression we want to give. We want to give the impression we're under control, or, we know things and stuff. For some of us, it's we've been taught that stoic is good and emotions are bad. And we've just got to get rid of the idea that they're bad. For some of us, we've been taught that emotions are scary. They're not scary, they're like informative, but we've been taught they're scary. So if we believe they're scary, we're going to have to get rid of the idea they're scary. Does that make sense? If we've been taught that they are like proof of our weakness, that's a big thing most of us have been taught. That when you're emotional, you're weak. How many men have said that to you girls when you're crying? Oh, you're just being insipid now, or oh, look at you, you're just going crying again now. Now we can't talk at all, or whatever. The implication being that when you're emotional, you're more stupid, right? You're dumber. None of these things are true. You're more intelligent, actually. But we have a set of false beliefs in us about our feelings that we are going to have to address. And they are the things I had to address, the first things I had to address. And without addressing that, I didn't receive any other truth until I addressed that problem. So all the things I share with you now, none of it I received until I addressed this problem. I didn't know these things beforehand. The emotions stopped me from knowing. The storage of emotions stops you from knowing. I thought I had everything sorted. But once I started going through my emotions, I realised I had nothing sorted. nothing. My whole life, I realised, was a complete schmozzle, really, mess. You know, that was only sorted by going through the emotion. Make sense? Pit stop again?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Please hit pissed off again.